she'll take that in.
Right.
And Rebecca and I have talked about this, as have all the other women on our team, that this seems like a vague answer, but a lot of times a woman will ask us, how am I to know if he's internally motivated to be well? Mm-hmm. And often what we'll say is, you will know. You'll experience him differently. And there is a sense of this wise adult in him that is taking over and really moving into wanting to be well more than anything.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we're going to continue our series on what men can do to rebuild trust with their wives. And with us we have Beth Miller, the lovely spouse of our host Greg Miller, and Rebecca Dekkers from the Faithful and True staff. How's everyone doing today?
We're doing great.
Well,
good
to be here.
Happy to have you with us.
The first thing I want to say is this is not show business nepotism that brings Beth into the podcast. She is qualified on her own. It's not because she knows me.
Yeah.
Very qualified.
Yeah, we'll buy that. Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Well, we are happy to have you with us, and we're happy to continue with this series. So today we're going to start off by talking about two other aspects of this, right, Greg?
Yeah, absolutely. So what if one of you just identifies kind of the specific topic that we're going to be talking about how a man can contribute to rebuilding trust with his wife?
Sure, I'll start. Yeah. Well, we thought that we could talk today a little bit about how rebuilding trust it is when someone doesn't let their wife's thoughts, feelings, behaviors, or opinions distract him from staying sober, from doing his work, and specifically the idea of internal motivation, that I know for myself what I would like, and I'm not so distracted from what my wife does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I will say this is very complicated, probably for the wife and also for the man, because for all of us that start recovery, there is a part of us that is doing this to save our marriage or to repair the relationship with our wife. And so this idea that I'm investing in my relationship because of my recovery, or I'm motivated to invest in my relationship through my recovery, is a valid thing. It just can't be the only thing. Mm. So what is it like for a wife? Like, what are some of the indicators that the husband may be more motivated to appease the wife or placate the wife versus to really be grounded in his own desire to be motivated to be well?
Mm. Well, I think one of the things that we see is if a person, a man who is working on his recovery, is really swayed in that by her anger or her frustration. If he is working hard to hustle for her approval more than be concerned about his own recovery, that's an indication that maybe there's not as much internal motivation on his part as we would want. And I think another really important indicator is who's in charge of his recovery. Mm-hmm. Is he the one, right, that's setting the appointments, going to groups, versus her being the one to remind him and find all the resources and almost be doing it for him to a degree. Yeah.
One of the indicators from my perspective, when I'm working with a man that his recovery is too based in his wife's approval, is if we spend a lot of our appointments talking about his wife and where she is and how she's responding. And at times that can be an appropriate conversation. And yet if that is the focus of what we're talking about, that's kind of a signal that he's too invested in his wife's reaction. It's kind of like he's doing his recovery for her versus he's doing his recovery for himself. And so what is the motivation, but what is also the focus of the recovery, and what causes him to want to do it? Rebecca, what is it that you see when you're working with a woman that might cause her concern that her husband is just doing it for her?
Well, I think often wives can feel it on some level. Sometimes it's not even just behaviors. There's this sense like, if I wiggle, he's going to fall, or if I'm not safe in how I show up, which sometimes, we're the goal and the striving is to be more and more safe and honest in our communication. But on the early stages, it's a really valid process to have to move through big emotions, to have to, in some ways complete the stress response cycle. I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling mad. And that there just is space for her to feel that without it derailing her partner. It's relieving often for wives that there's a little bit more space for me to do that. And so similar to what we've been saying, it's just that general sense that my feelings are okay. You don't quite need me to be okay for you to be okay. That I can, as I'm doing my work to practice speaking and communicating safely, but there's room for all of my emotions.
One of the things I'm kind of hearing is it's disorienting for a spouse if her perception is her husband's recovery is fragile, and that it can be swayed by a big reaction. And so she may feel like she has to contain her reaction in order to not break his recovery. And maybe if she has more confidence and he has more confidence, that I can be with her in her big emotions, whether it's grief or sadness or anger. And one of the big things that I know can be triggering for a man is if what he perceives is apathy. And so there may actually be a season where a wife seems disinterested in his recovery. In fact, I've had men tell me, my wife doesn't want to know anything about my recovery. And so in that season, does he still find himself committed in doing the recovery for himself? One of the phrases that I use at the workshop is I talk about the fact that early on in our process, one of the best gifts that Beth gave me was the gift of no hope. That there was really no belief on my part that our marriage was going to make it. And so I started my recovery for me and for our boys because I wanted it for myself. And that doesn't mean I was always detached. I did read the room. I still was conscious of how Beth responded. But there's a difference between including my spouse and going to my spouse for approval. Sometimes men can have the energy of an adolescent or a little boy, and he wants to check in with his spouse like he's checking in with his homework. I did my recovery homework. Are you proud of me? Do I get a sticker? That's probably the energy that is concerning for a wife to experience.
And I would say in the early months especially, if a husband is coming to his wife asking in so many words, look what I've done, aren't you proud of me? Her response is usually, it could be a variety of things, but one of which might be like, way to go. That's what it means to be faithful. That's what it means to be like, there might not be a lot of empathy and encouragement around that. And I can say that that was actually very helpful for me, Greg, when I wasn't doing that on purpose to communicate, hey, let's see how this goes if I pull away. I knew that's what I needed. I needed some healthy space to discern what was possible. And it was so trust building to watch that you were committed to doing your work no matter what response you were or weren't getting from me. And I also just want to say I have a lot of empathy for women who can recognize, yeah, I'm probably over in his lane because I am fearful of what's going to happen if he doesn't go after this. And that is such a chaotic place to begin to take our hands off of that, right? And to step back, because at the end of the day, we absolutely need to know that our partner is internally motivated to be well, that it isn't about something that if I take my hands off, it's all going to crumble,
Right. One thing I often hear men say that their wives have said is, why should I affirm you for something you should have been doing all along? And so it's kind of just wisdom for the spouse, for the husband, not to be going to his wife for initial approval and affirmation. And I do think that there's a value to find your desire apart from somebody else's approval. And I do think that this is one of the benefits of separation for those couples that feel like separation is a good option for them. Because in our separation, I wasn't around for your positive reactions. I wasn't around for your negative reactions. And I probably would have been much more hooked into those if I had been. The challenge is to be living with the person whose reactions are so present, and then staying grounded in your truth, no matter what the reaction is, as you're working your program of recovery.
That's where those early days are often so difficult because, I like to talk about how there's sort of two valid processes happening at the exact same time. And they often sort of collide or cause problems when we're perhaps sharing the same house while we're trying to move through this. Like the wife has a valid amount of big emotions and stress responses to move through. And that's valid. That needs to happen, safely, well, to move through it truly, but that's valid processes. But over here, we have that valid process, like you said, Greg, of wanting to, repair in the relationship possible damage, but also wanting to practice that internal motivation, moving towards health, recovery, wholeness for myself, like practicing learning how to live perhaps in the truth now that my cover's been blown in some ways. So trying to, be honest about things and sort of wanting to check it out. It's valid to want to do that, but they often in the early stages cause a lot of conflict.
Right. Well, and even the idea of for a husband to accept my wife's reaction is valid. And I love what you're talking about, that there's actually a process that we need to go through when we have a strong emotion, because if we don't do that, we're going to hold on to something and it's going to stay contained. So there is this release of the strong emotion that can easily be directed at the spouse if he's in proximity, and for him not to take that on and to see that, okay, I'm going to measure my recovery based upon my wife's reaction. I'm going to be aware of my wife's reaction, and I'm not going to let it define my recovery for me. And what can be challenging is if the wife has strong opinion about what the husband should be doing. I hear a lot of things where my wife really wants me to read this book, or my wife wants me to listen to this podcast or to watch this video. And to find the balance of this is my recovery, and I can hear my wife's suggestion. And one of the things that we talked about in a previous podcast is it is easier if I start with the belief that my wife is for me and she wants what is best for me. If I believe that my wife is on my team, even if we're disconnected in the relationship, even if she doesn't feel like she can be present with me, if I can believe that she's for me, I will hear these encouragements, these invitations through a very different lens. And if it's coming out of fear and my wife is trying to find safety in my reaction, that can create all kinds of chaos.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yep, you go. Well, I was just going to say, it often can feel for wives very safe when, like you said, Greg, the husband can perhaps hear her and gently scooch her to the edge of his hoop and say, I hear you, and this is part of my recovery plan. This is what I would like. Even, while initially that doesn't feel so great to be scooched, but there's something trust building in that. He's got it. I don't have to climb in and manage. He's got a plan.
I was just going to add, I think this is where if a couple can get their support from the same place, some of the, the same resources, maybe not 100% everything is the same, but speaking some similar language is so helpful. And so those can be helpful invitations to say, hey, I listened to this podcast. I found this really helpful, or I read this book, or, I went to this workshop at this place. This counseling center has been really helpful for me. I think that some of the connections in that can be very helpful when we learn to speak some similar language.
I would also say the invitation is easier to hear when it's clear. What's true is most of us have a strong reaction if we perceive that somebody has an agenda for us and they're not being honest or clear about that. And so if a wife can say, and the reason I'd like for you to listen to this podcast is they address this issue of boundaries. And my perception is this is something that you may struggle with. Okay, well, I can hear that. Or this particular podcast talks about intimacy and what intimacy is. And my sense is we've not had that in our relationship. But if I'm just offered something, but I'm not sure why I'm being offered, especially if I'm codependent or enmeshed, I may do it, but I'm constantly doing it for the other person. What are they wanting me to get out of it versus what am I able to get out of it? And if I know what they'd like for me to hear, then I can be attuned to that, but I don't have to be controlled or defined by that.
I think another thing that I hear sometimes that is good to mention in this topic is where a husband will ask his wife, can you promise me that you won't leave? Can you promise me that, we're going to be okay? And that is too big of a request. I mean, if a wife can say, yes, I'm here, if that's true and congruent for her, then so be it, absolutely. But there are often times where there's been some really significant betrayal that it's not even healthy for a wife to be too quick to answer that question. And that's one of the places where I think he may be looking for that as the impetus to do his work. And I worked with a woman several years ago who would say to her husband in the early months, I'm here today. I'm here today. And I'm going to keep doing my work, and I hope you'll keep doing yours. And I thought that was so wise. And I hope she's not still saying that to him, several years later, right? Like that's not the long-term goal, but in those early weeks and months, that may be just too much to ask. And a good indication of him doing his work and being internally motivated is being able to surrender that and to say, that's my desire that we would be together. And it's my desire that I am committed to being well no matter what happens. She'll take that in, and Rebecca and I have talked about this, as have all the other women on our team, that this seems like a vague answer, but a lot of times a woman will ask us, how am I to know if he's internally motivated to be well? And often what we'll say is, you will know. You'll experience him differently. And there is a sense of this wise adult in him that is taking over and really moving into wanting to be well more than anything.
Well, what's interesting is even that question, can you tell me you're not going to leave me? Part of the issue with that question is it's based upon the assumption that the husband can receive that and believe it himself. If he had confidence in himself and in the relationship, then he would probably be in a different place in the way that he is living. But the problem is, if I'm basically asking someone, do you choose me? Well, in order for me to receive that, I have to believe that I am choosable. And that question may have the agenda, I want my spouse to rescue me from my fears, my insecurities, and my shame. And the way we switch it, and what I would encourage the man to do, is let's work on your shame so that you can believe you are choosable even if your wife isn't choosing you, because God created you to be choosable. That's your identity. Because if I am dependent upon somebody else to choose me, to believe I'm choosable, I'm always going to be trying to pickpocket that from them. And so it's almost as if the asking of the question is an indication that he's not ready for the answer. And so there's that work that he needs to do of some shedding of shame, living in truth, healing old wounds, so that he can just show up in the relationship with whatever it is that his wife is able to offer to him in that moment and on that day. And here, I want to say this. In the early days of recovery, I was nowhere near that. You know, this healing thing takes time. We all bring our unhealth into it. And one of the challenges is, in the early days of recovery, it's not like my survivor strategies are simply gone. Whatever I had was there. I was simply trying to minimize them and live more as a wise man. And so it makes sense in the early days of recovery, we don't show up with our best selves. The key and the shift is I'm now aware that I'm not showing up with my best self, and I'm trying to do something about it.
I think the way that we have worded this principle, that he doesn't let my behaviors, opinions, or feelings distract him from being sober, there's a couple of things that I think would be good for us to talk about in this. One, I would say to any husbands listening, expect your wife to have some really big feelings. One way or the other, either a lot of anger, a lot of grief, or a lot of like withdrawal. Maybe it's a lot of silence. And she's finding her way through some really incredible pain. And sometimes one of the things we hear is that he's feeling free for the first time in years or decades. And there may be safe men in his community that can celebrate that freedom with him and be with him in that place. She, on the other hand, may feel like a dump truck just got, backed up and dumped onto her with the heaviness of the weight of this information in the early days of discovery. So I want to say, expect her to be angry. That's normal. That's a normal reaction, actually, for her to validate this is not okay. It's actually honoring of herself to have that. That being said, I know, Rebecca, you and I talked about this idea that this also doesn't just give the spouse a blank check to say or do whatever she wants. Do you want to speak to that a little bit, Rebecca?
Yeah, that it is a process for her to learn how to express it. I like just to say cleanly, but that's the idea of self-differentiation. And again, that there's a felt sense that you can maintain your sense of self, that sense of freedom that you might have, and that I get then a little bit more space to move through it. And often just that felt sense that your partner is in that stronger, and I like that word that you're using, Greg, more confident in his process place, I find with the women I work with often helps them get to that cleaner, more safe way of expressing it. I don't need to I always tell clients, I don't need to elbow for my anger, to room for my anger. I don't need to elbow. Like all of a sudden when I realize I'm not having to fight for my space to feel my feelings, I feel like, oh, I can let go of them a little quicker. So definitely, in a good therapeutic relationship, you're learning how to express that cleanly. But it's often such a gift from the partners that there's room for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I like the image that I'm able to receive it and hold it without becoming defensive. That if my wife shows up with anger, I can just receive it. I don't have to put my guard up and push against it. And very much what you're saying, Rebecca, that space is created because once we know that there's space for our feelings, we're able to express them and then, as you identified, release them. I also think that the language in this is important. It's that it doesn't distract me. We're not saying that a man isn't impacted by his wife's emotions or he doesn't have feelings about them. We have reactions to other people's reactions. But they don't become a distraction. He stays focused on the recovery. And this is the place where our community is so important. And there's a difference. If I go to my small group or my community and I just talk about my wife, that's not ultimately going to be helpful. But if I go to my community and I talk about me, I talk about my grief, my sadness, even my hurt, my anger about how my wife is responding, then I can offload some of that to my community and I can come back to my wife with more space. So we're not talking about you deny it, you ignore it, you avoid it. You simply receive it and then you find healthy, safe ways to bring it to your community so that you are able to share it so that, again, you go back and have more space. Because if I'm just taking stuff on, but I'm not offloading anything, eventually I'll have no space to receive anything else, and that's going to create all kinds of
and ideally, we would encourage women to do the same thing, that they're getting into safe community. They're working with their therapist to find healthy ways to move through and express their anger, their grief, their pain. Because like you just said, Greg, to take all of that, especially in the early, season of this, to take all of that to their partner will likely flood him. And it doesn't mean, though, that she doesn't have valid needs to really express that and find a way through it. And that can, that can be done in safe community because she needs an empathetic witness to that level of anguish.
One thing I would say as we're coming to an end is I started with this where we are invested in our recovery in the hope that it will heal our relationship. And there's nothing wrong with that. That my motivation was to engage my family and my kids. And once I heard Beth say that there was hope for that, that really was something that I desired, a vision that I had. So to say I want a part of the vision of my recovery to be to heal my family and redeem my marriage is beautiful. And it cannot be the only thing. Because then what happens is, it's that principle that I heard Mark talk about. There's this belief that anything you put in front of your recovery, you have the possibility then of losing. So if I put my marriage in front of my recovery, ultimately I may actually lose my marriage. And yet if my marriage benefits from my recovery, it keeps me focused on my recovery.
Yeah, well said.
Well said, Greg. What a great way to wrap this up. We really appreciate Rebecca and Beth joining us today on the Faithful and True podcast. And we would like to have you both back to continue the conversation about the things that a husband or a man can do to help rebuild trust in his relationship with his spouse. In the meantime, if you've heard this podcast and you've identified that you need the help that we offer you at Faithful and True, we invite you to visit our website, faithfulandtrue.com, and there you'll find podcasts like this. We have over 400 podcasts that are free and available for you to enjoy. And we also have all of the information and registration available for our 3-day intensive workshops. We do the Men's Journey Workshop every month. We do the Women's Workshop a few times a year, the next one coming up in January. And then we also have the Couples Workshop, which is coming up in February. We invite you to check out those details and register for one of those events if that fits your situation the best. In the meantime, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.